don't know what to do for the intro. I'll just do the same one as anyway, because we're 5 seconds in
It
now.
feels like a bit late to figure out a new one, if you ask me.
We're 15 episodes in, and that's...
Well, no, also just in the sense that we're already recording, to be honest.
That as well. I think we should just power through. My name's Ewan Gleadow. That's Graham Williamson. Wonderful to have you back on the podcast, the most professional podcast on Spotify and Apple Music that you can get. And it's on YouTube as well. So if you've watched previous episodes, you'll know I've been blinded by the sun once before. I've not made that same mistake today. I have put the blind down.
The man has invested in blinds technology.
Oh, yeah. I mean, to be fair, it's December. It shouldn't be sunny. It should be like outside, should feel like a Scott Walker album. It shouldn't be bright and lovely. But we move on. No, like I said, I'm Ewan Gleadow, writer for places and podcaster at other places. Graham Williamson's joined me again. Thank you very much for hopping on.
Absolutely, no problem. Yeah.
Just before we did this recording, I was thinking the very first podcast I ever did was with you for Spice World.
What a baptism of fire that would have been.
Yeah, and it's amazing that this will be my last ever podcast on Scott Walker for this podcast. No, it's great to have you back. How have you been? You've been listening to anything good recently?
Well, I've got one answer for this, which will allow people to date exactly when we recorded this, because I listened to the Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me soundtrack by Angelo Badalamenti in honour of his passing the other night. What a record that is!
It's stunning.
I cannot think of a more eclectic movie score, like without going into things like where there's score interspersed with needle drops.
Yeah.
The idea that one artist can cover that range of sounds on a movie soundtrack is incredible. It's such a beautiful record.
It's absolutely stunning. It's a shame about his passing as well, but that is a quality album. For some reason, I thought when you said you'll be able to date this episode, I thought you were going to say the new Lad Baby single, which really, really scared me.
Well, yeah, some artists it's tragic when they pass, and some artists it's tragic when they don't.
I mean, as soon as that happened, I saw Skinner and Baddiel had released a new 3 Lions version. I thought, joy to all.
Yeah, brilliant. This is what Christmas 2022 is going to be like. We thought we'd got over the worst with the pandemic abating, and now a new plague has emerged.
The plague of Christmas songs. But to belay that a little bit, I'm just going to plug this because I'm shameless and I enjoy good music. I just got back from seeing Richard Hawley at Sunderland, at the fire station. So I've seen him in a cathedral, I've seen him in a fire station, and now I'm going to see him in a lead mill. Eventually, I will see him in a normal, standard venue that doesn't have any association with steelworks or fire services. Until then, though, to be fair, I usually put a record in the background, but when it cuts off, you can't see it. But I did get this because I like to plug good music. And this is Katie Spencer's new record, which is called The Edge of the Land. She opened for Richard Hawley. Unbelievable. Yeah. I've not actually listened to it all yet because I'm doing a review for it, but I know it's good enough to actually recommend listening. Look at that. Look at the glow of the light there.
That's good for a Halloween special, I think.
Yeah, it's just, unfortunately it's not. Do I have to record my Halloween specials on days where it's sunny? If I get in sunner, I catch the glow. It's like, welcome to. I don't know if there are any Halloween records on there actually. Maybe Scott Walker's The Drift is on there.
You probably invest in some sort of a light. I think that would be
in this economy. No. I've had to stop drinking. Well, I was going to say I've had to stop drinking coffee. I've got one here, but I'm trying to quit coffee. But speaking of trying to quit things, I'm trying to quit listening to shit music, which I'm very glad to say we don't have that issue here. It's the first time I've been genuinely excited to record an episode for this because work is hell and I like Scott Walker.
Yes.
But Scott 4, number 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, Scott 4, which is the record he did before When the Band Comes In, which I remember from Bad Cover Version, that Pulp song where they slagged him off and he produced their record.
Yes, he did.
Which is wonderful.
Although pointedly only the second side of Till the Band Comes In, which is a very meaningful distinction if you can hear it, because there's lots of records where the artist sort of loses control of where it's going, but Till the Band Comes In is the only record where it happens so abruptly that you can actually hear it on the record, where the first half of it is gorgeous, Scott Walker pushing his signature solo sound into like even more adventurous terrain, and the second half might as well begin with the bailiffs turning up at his door.
The creativity bailiffs are here for him. Thankfully, that didn't happen for Scott 4, which is the first and I believe only Scott Walker album in the 1001 albums to listen to before he died by Robert Dimery, which I did leave out in the lack of intro there. But I think intros are, they're old hat. Who needs them? It's like interviews I do. Don't use questions. What's the point?
Well, the intro suggests that the podcast is starting, and I think that doesn't really take into account the podcast landscape nowadays.
Yeah.
The podcasts never end.
It never
the
ends.
world is, in a great sense, one endless podcast.
This is my world. This is my podcast.
Marvin Gaye and Tabby Terrell hurriedly redraft their lyrics.
It's the lack of songs that are to do with me is frankly shocking.
Yeah.
But maybe Marvin Gaye will do another record. I don't know. Doubt it. But I mean, Scott Walker though. Just to get us back onto Scott 4. I'll do the really boring insert bit, and then we're gonna have a chat about Scott Walker.
Yes.
Because mandatory for those that have just tuned into this for the first time. It's not usually this insane, but it's just fun to do away with the old hat of introducing yourself. We take a look at the 1001 albums to listen to before you die, or allegedly should. Robert Dimery's collection of, well, like I just said, 1001 albums. And whether or not they're all worth listening to is obviously down to subjective opinion. But there are just several facts that can't be removed, really, such as Different Class is the best album on that list, or that Nirvana's got one too many albums on there, or that Joan Baez's debut should not be on there because she's got better albums further down the line. A lot of inconsistencies that I thought I'd take it personally upon myself to sort out, because editing is difficult these days. Who's got time for that? I have time for that. I work from home. Anyways, some keynotes on Scott 4, which I'm sure we are already aware of, because the keynotes that I found for this are very simple. Scott 4, written and sung by Scott Walker. Who'd have thought it, in 1969. Yeah. I don't know why I've written Scott 4, Scott Walker, and then Scott Walker's name again.
Well, I suppose it can help, because when this was originally released, it was released under his birth name of Scott Engel.
Scott Engel, yeah. Which is... We'll talk about the release of this album in a bit, because that's sort of a big part of this. It kind of overshadows the quality of it. But a nice little Baroque pop, and the second genre that they've given is singer-songwriter, which caters to a lot of people, I imagine.
Yeah, not really a genre, is it? I mean, I guess that I know what they mean, because everyone has an image of what a singer-songwriter does, but in terms of somebody who sings their music and writes it, that's like Little Sims does that.
Yeah.
But she's not what people think of when they talk about a singer-songwriter.
It's kind of too broad of a genre to say it's anybody's favourite. It's like, oh, my favourite genre, the singer-songwriter genre. My favourite album from that genre is Johnny Cash. It's like, you can't get away with that. But Baroque pop, I think, is a nice sort of arena to throw Scott Walker into.
Yes.
As this insert does. Which does not hold any punches. It just kind of opens up, and you'll see what I mean.
Okay.
After his fourth solo album was a commercial failure, the naturally shy Scott Walker gave up writing for much of the next decade and became a virtual recluse.
Slight quibble there, but we'll let it play out. We'll let it play out.
I think after this is the 15th episode, the quibbles are just fast and free. I'm sure we'll clear those up, because there's a couple of other quibbles.
Okay.
A shame, because Scott 4 is a breathtaking album. Walker's first entirely self-composed work. The orchestral bombast that characterised his previous solo albums is stripped back, its sparse feel perfectly complementing the rich baritone. Open to the Seventh Seal marries Ennio Morricone-influenced orchestral textures to a narrative based on the film of the same name by Ingmar Bergman, Walker the Europhile's favourite director. Now, can I just say, those last 5 words, they don't make sense to me. Walker the Europhile's favourite director. It's a very wordy way of saying Scott Walker's favourite director was Ingmar Bergman.
Yes, it sort of implies that Walker the Europhile likes
Yes.
this director, but Walker the lad about town was more of a Michael Bay man. You should have known not to drink the coffee then.
I need to drink it now because it's getting cold. I've put it in the sun, but it's not working. Obviously, that's a minor quibble, and I'm only in the first paragraph, but that's like a big part of. I'm going to go very off topic for a moment here, but the big part of music journalism and music writing is that people use big words to make themselves sound smart. But for 3 years,
Yes.
when I was studying journalism, it was write it simply, simple as best. The shortest you can imagine and the simplest you can imagine is the best way to go about it because it means your point is firm, but it's also very easy to understand. Walker, the Europhile's favourite director, implies that either Scott Walker's favourite director was Ingmar Bergman, or Europhile Ingmar Bergman was the director of Scott Walker's favourite director. It doesn't make much sense. And neither does the second paragraph.
Oh.
The old man's back again sees Walker, an avowed socialist, warning of the spectre of Stalinism in the Eastern Bloc following Russia's 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, over a funky bass line. The rousing Get Behind Me and the passionate Duchess explore Walker's growing interest in soul and country music respectively, while his emotional vocal conveys haunting vulnerability on the world's strongest man. Hero of the War cynically and intelligently parodies the growth of militarism. Boy Child is a meditation on innocence set to spine-tingling arrangement, which very much strikes me as, oh, quick, get the Sparks notes up, quick, we've got a paragraph to fill out. Just quickly understand all the songs, there you go, rattle it off. And then, the record elicited mixed and confused reactions on release and was deleted just weeks later, yet it was to receive critical re-evaluation thanks to its influence on the likes of David Bowie, Nick Cave, Mark Almond, and the Divine Comedy's Neil Hannon. Now rightfully reissued, its lush textures and extraordinary breadth of scope will astound many generations to come.
It's incredible to think that there was a time when a record could be released and then the company could just decide, no, good money after bad, let's get rid of this and delete it. I mean, nowadays you have to be a major HBO series before that can happen to you.
Unless you're the KLF, you're not allowed to get rid of anything these days.
Yes.
Which is, for good or ill, because there's a lot of really shit albums that should just be sort of sentenced out there, just into the depths, delete them.
That's true, yeah.
I listened to Mr. Blobby's first album, so
the album, not just the single, his artistic statement.
The album. You know what the worst part is? It's all right.
Yeah.
It's like as a conventional novelty pop thing, where it's essentially Mr. Blobby and Noel Edmonds are pretty much being held hostage in a radio studio, and Mr. Blobby is regaling Noel Edmonds with, "Oh, do you remember that bit on Noel Edmonds' house party?" And then Mr. Blobby sings a song. It's got a narrative throughout it. It's fascinating.
It's a concept album.
It honestly is. It's a concept album. And speaking of concept albums, that is, Mr. Blobby did much the same as Scott Walker, who, with Scott... I can't do that link, seriously. I'm sorry. I tried. Scott 4 is... memories-wise with this album, I always like to ask this because it's not just an easy question to pass some time on the podcast, but also because it actually gets... to the depths of why people pick certain albums to talk about. And
yes,
Scott 4, I remember in the email you said was better than the Seventh Seal, track-wise. I agree completely. I was just wondering sort of what your connection to this album is.
Well, in terms of Scott Walker in general, the first Scott Walker song I heard was a song from this album where have you ever seen the Radiohead documentary Meeting People is Easy?
I've not, no, because my love for Radiohead is the equivalent of my love for Marmite. I'm not particularly fond either way.
Right.
But I do need to watch it because, it's Radiohead and I'll get clicks if I review it.
Pop screen episode on that then. But
fantastic.
Yes.
Just don't make me listen to Kid A.
But there's a bit in Meeting People is Easy where it's one of the film's many montages of Tom York looking miserable in a hotel room, and they play this song, which I thought was incredible. I thought it was the saddest thing I'd ever heard, and I was aware of Scott Walker in the way that you were aware of things when you read the music press in like not pre-internet, but before the internet was something where you can just type a song name into it or half of a lyric and it'll immediately come up with what you mean. But I'd heard the legend of Scott Walker before. This guy who was in what was essentially a boy band, who went solo, who made a string of solo albums that all flopped at the time, but have now been reassessed as works of genius, and is now an avant-garde musician. And when I heard that song on Meeting People Is Easy, part of me thought, that sounds like it could be Scott Walker. It sounds like the kind of music people are describing. And I looked it up and it was On Your Own again, the second track on this, which is it's
Wonderful.
one of those songs which is so gorgeous and so short that you couldn't possibly expand it. It ends just as it starts to really sting, and that's the point.
Sorry, I was taking a sip of water there.
No, sorry,
No,
yeah,
no,
I
absolutely.
entered it abruptly in homage to that song.
That was it. I just wasn't ready for it because I just finished my coffee and then I immediately thought, "Ooh, water," and I was like, "Hmm." I think it's, to be fair, because yesterday it took me that long to get out, and I've essentially inhaled half of a smoke machine's output, so
Yes,
my mouth's really clammy, which is perfect for a podcast.
of
But no, you're
course.
absolutely right about the abruptness of the second track and the sort of the feelings around the album. It's very avant-garde. It's very not. I mean, by today's standard, it's kind of, you know, very appreciated, very liked, very well regarded, and
Mm,
it's rather stunning that at the time of its release, everybody went, "Ah, Scott, mate, what are you doing, lad?"
yes, because
Which is a shame.
it's quite approachable in a lot of ways, isn't it?
Yeah,
When you hear that it's out of those out of that run of 4 solo albums that he started off with, you hear that this is the last of them, that it was, like, even by the standards of the other ones, which did not sell many copies, it was a disastrous flop. And it's the only one that has no cover versions on. So part of you thinks, right, it must be like the dark heart of his material. It must be the one that was so bleak and so avant-garde that it just snapped his remaining fans' patience. And in some ways, yes, but it's also an album full of really catchy short songs. It's not the drift, is it? You mentioned the drift early on, and it's not that.
the Drift is wonderful as
Mm.
an album that if you don't like someone, tell them to listen to that as their entry point for Scott Walker, and they'll leave well alone. Um, I was talking to my mate about it, and he was like, "Just what is it? It's like the galleons coming into port, pal. Get it, listen, get it on." And it's
Yeah.
utterly stunning that the guy that did, when the band comes in, can go on to
Mm.
do what is essentially. I don't even know what the words to describe it. It sounds like the screams of a man locked in a fridge, and it's beautiful.
The drift is famously the one where he does, I think, a 13-minute song
Yes,
about
yeah,
the
yeah.
execution of Mussolini and his mistress, and the percussion is just someone punching a side of beef over and over again.
It's
Uh, so that's
is
the album.
it's Bish Bosch as well, his last album, which has the incredible 21-minute track, SDSS1416 plus 13B, which
I
is
mean,
very Scott Walker.
yeah,
Wonderful stuff, and Tilt as well. I suppose we should mention, because that's honestly terrifying, just
Tilt
really
is
scary.
very scary. Yeah, Farmer in the City is one of the most
It's
utterly hopeless, abject
yeah,
sounding songs you'll ever hear.
which is, I mean, at the time, Farmer in the City, Babe had just came out, so everyone was like, "Oh, Farmer in the City, Babe in the City, brilliant! Scott Walker's done a Babe soundtrack, brilliant!" It was not to be. It was really quite something else. But
Yes.
something else indeed was Scott 4, which I remember listening to um, last year, like in May.
Mm,
Very summery album, of course.
of course.
Um,
Yeah.
but it was
Full
when
of the
I'd just
joys of
gotten
spring.
spring, summer. It's all the same to me. It's raining either way. Um, but it was pretty early on in the 1001 albums book, and I was like, all right, I've heard of Scott Walker before, because obviously Pulp Song did a reference to him. Of course I've heard of him.
Of
um,
course.
and then actually listening to his work, I thought that is stunning.
Yeah.
And it's one of the few in the early stages of this book where I've listened to it and then gone to listen to it again. It's like, yeah, that's still perfect, that's unbelievable. I mean, I listened to it again this morning,
Yeah.
Unbelievable, just absolutely stunning. I mean, it opens with the Seventh Seal. That Morricone influence is immediate. It's right there at the start, and then it shifts. It shifts into this nice acoustic ballad with a real beat to it and a real
Mm.
pace. And it is just a retelling of Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, and it's that transition is amazing and also superior.
It's a surprisingly faithful retelling of Ingmar Bergman's The
Mm.
Seventh Seal. I would go so far as to say that I know a lot of people are trying to work their way through the Sight and Sound top 100 at the moment, and if you want to save a bit of time, you could probably just listen to the song instead of watching the whole movie.
You know what? You're not wrong. It's I've not actually looked at the whole Sight and Sound list myself. I saw Jean Dielman was number one. And everyone kicking up a fuss, and I thought, either way, I'm not going to watch it. I've not 4 hours to kill. I said I'd watch Satan Tango last year, and I didn't watch that. So I'm going to stick to my
Yes.
Bruce Willis action films from the mid 2010s.
Oh, well, it turns out that's like most of the rest of the top 10.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Did they put Precious Cargo on the list? Did they?
They've got they've got surrogates on there. Yeah, they've got the one he did with Mos Def. Yeah.
Oh god, when that list came out, I saw a tweet that said, "What would a top 10 for the Sight and Sound list be if it was for albums?" And
Mm.
I tried quote tweeting it, and I thought, no, you know what? Because the albums I put down, while very good, were not good. You know what I mean? It's like it didn't make sense to have those on the list, and it was trying to find a broad range of everything covered in 10 albums. And
Yeah.
I think now that I've thought about it more, I think Scott 4 would be in that top 10 of, if you want the best representation of music and how it's evolved and how it's cultured, Scott 4's got to be on there because it is so fundamentally interesting. I think just from a perspective of behind the scenes as well as the actual tracks on the album,
Mm.
it's monumental. It really is. I mean, you take something like, you mentioned it on your own again, just the abrupt end, the stop, and it's that is commonplace now where people experiment with that sound and that sort of courage almost to do something a bit different. At the
Yeah.
time, it appears that it was laughed out of the room. It was to the point of deletion, which is insane.
Well, I think having it on the like recommended list of things for people to listen to teaches you an important lesson where obviously there's a lot of people who think that if a record doesn't sell, it must be because it's a bad record. But I think you could play anyone the old man's back again, and one, they're going to like it because it's great. Two, if you tell them that the album this was from did not chart and was deleted after a week or two, they're going to be absolutely perplexed by that.
And it's, I mean, we kind of glossed over what for the younger audience. I mean, I say that being 22, but the younger audience out there. So the deletion was apparently Scott Walker's request. He saw that the album had not fared well, and as that introduction said, a very shy recluse
Mm,
wanted rid of the album. Essentially, wanted it rid, and I think it was Phillips at the time obliged. They said, yeah, sure, and that was it until about 2008 when it got reprinted, and that reprint was allegedly quite bad, and it's not been printed since, which is to the behest of me because I desperately want it. Um, but it says a lot about the power of an artist at the time that they can just turn and say, "Please get rid of this," and the label have gone, "Okay."
I think
Um,
when we say the power of an artist, we have to like factor in the fact that the record did not chart.
yeah,
I'm sure
as
if
well.
Fleetwood Mac said, "You know what, we're kind of sick of rumours. Can you delete that?" I don't think the record company would have complied with that one.
I feel like they may have not known who Scott Walker was at the time. He's walking into the
Yes.
office and request, "Can you delete Scott Thorpe?" He's like, "Who the fuck are you? What? No, go away." I remember it was Brian Adams just did an interview recently where he said the record label asked him if they wanted him to stop pushing Summer of '69. He said, "No, you'd be mad to do that. It's making us so much money." Um, and I can't remember the other song. I think it was it's one of those songs that you know, and I can't
Would it
remember the
have
name of it.
been Everything I Do It For You? Because that was famously at number
That'll be it,
one
yeah.
forever.
And I think it was he charted that in number one in Holland like 10 years after its release, and his label told me, it was like, "Oh, okay." Um, it says a lot about the state of sort of songs that hit the charts that stick around. Like Tub Thumping's the best example I can think of from Chumbawamba.
The
who
one that I always think about is that there was an artist around when I was at university who was everywhere, and I thought, this is shit. But at least after this year ends, I'm never going to have to hear about this person again. No one's ever going to want to listen to this music ever again. And that artist was Avril Lavigne, which is why I don't make predictions about what's going to be successful.
Oh, you could not have backed a worse horse.
I couldn't, no.
To be fair, I remember when. Do you remember Mumford and Sons?
Oh, yeah. With
I,
their
I
fashy banjo player.
that's the one, yeah. Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah, but I was like, oh, after that, I was like, that's them killed off. No way any Mumford or Son album will release. And then apparently one of them's just done a solo album.
Yeah.
I mean, it says a lot about chart success and the sort of longevity of it that albums that haven't even charted are on this list because of how influential they were on other music.
Yeah.
Um, the likes of obviously Velvet Underground and Nico charted. It did quite well with the Andy Warhol stuff, but again, that's an influence on a lot of artists. I'm pretty sure it was something like for every album sold, Velvet Underground influenced an artist. Something mad like that. I've definitely butchered that quote, but it was somewhere along those lines. And I feel like the same happened for Scott Ford, but obviously he only sold about 30 copies. So it's,
Yeah,
you know,
and I think that list of people who were influenced by it, like Damon Albarn, like Mark
yeah.
Harmond, it's an interesting pointer as to what kind of artist this produced. If you're attracted to that idea of being a crooner, if you want to sing big ballads, but you don't want to sing anything that's trite or cheesy or commercial, here is the album that gives you a way to do that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was looking on Wikipedia, the most trusted encyclopedia, and
Yes.
they also cited Lou Reed and David Bowie, which makes a lot of sense. And then you've got
Mm.
the likes of Nick Cave, and you've got you're very right. It's the ballad type people that are. I think I don't want to call Scott Walker a pioneer because pioneer is just a shit word. It's a cop out, but he really was an artist that could have influenced a lot more had he at the time received more success. And it's a shame because he was pretty successful, but not to the
Yeah.
extent he should have been.
And I mean, he's also dealing with this albatross in his background of having had commercial success very early with the
Yeah,
Walker brothers, who, produced some fantastic pop, had some wonderful songs. Make It Easy on Yourself is a lovely, lovely record that still stands up today. And he thought that he could use that as a springboard to get people interested in the more sort of avant-garde music that he was interested in. And
yeah,
you can see why he did think that. I mean, the Beatles were doing much the same thing. If you'd gone like to someone at the start of the Beatles' career and said, "You see those the cute little lads in the mouse suits who were doing I Want to Hold Your Hand," they're going to be doing like 5-minute sitar jams in 4 years' time. Absolutely no one would have taken that bet. And I can see why Scott Walker thought his Walker Brothers fame would enable him to do something similar. But for whatever reason, it just didn't click.
yeah. It's bang on there with the Beatles comparison because it's kind of you think of the the longevity that comes with an artist that separates from a band and eventually goes off to do their own thing. They use that as a launch pad all the time. The
Mm,
four Beatles are the best examples. John Lennon did his protest stuff. George Harrison was very deeply moved by religion. Paul McCartney wanted to be another member of a group, and Ringo Starr and Scott Walker. Ringo Starr thought, "I'm going to get all my chums together,"
Ringo
and then
Starr thought, I'd love to do the narration for a show about a talking train.
Ringo Starr just he does my tits in. But with Scott Walker, it's the controlled idea of, oh well, I've had success here. I can use that. I can
Mm,
push forward with it, and it's striking how few artists have actually managed it. Because I mean, even
yeah,
now, I mean, Gaz Coombs from Supergrass is launching his new album. Dave Rowntree, the drummer from Blur, is
very
setting up his
harsh.
next
That
album.
very harsh as a thing to refer to Dave Brown as dumber.
Dave Rowntree is a lovely man. I will hear no slander of his radio songs, which is what his album's called. Um, but there is something to be said for success not always equating for a group as it does with a solo act. You think of the best examples, Iggy and the Stooges. It happens. Things like
Yeah.
that. Lou Reed's solo career, things like that are possible. But Scott Walker is unfortunately evidence that it is not easy, because even with great music and greater intentions, I mean, stuff like The World's Strongest Man, it's
Oh,
unbelievable.
it's
It's a
such a
stunning
gorgeous
song.
song. Yeah.
And I mean, lyrically, just across the board, utterly brilliant, just absolutely fantastic. And
Yeah.
it's not something that isn't difficult to connect with. It's very easy. It's very easy to slip into this album, and very approachable, like you said earlier. It's a very easy album to just lose yourself in.
There's a few songs on there like World's Strongest Man, like Rhymes of Goodbye, maybe even Get Behind Me, maybe, where
Yeah,
you can imagine them being given to a more commercial singer. You can imagine maybe Tom Jones or Joe Cocker having a run at those, and they would stand out because they're gorgeous songs that are well written,
yeah.
but they wouldn't make you think, hang on, Tom Jones has gone mad. What's this?
Well, it's not
So
unusual, so it had to be done. It had to be done. You make a very good point there, where it opens that horrible door of Scott Walker is first a songwriter, second a musician, because his songwriting abilities are stunning. There was just something apparently about his image at the time that people didn't particularly like, which is a
yeah.
shame.
And I suppose maybe when you look at this in the context of 1969, it's like the quote unquote difficult music that was creeping in at the end of the 60s was very inward focused. It was very about the sort of internal kind of acid trip head exploration stuff. It's all about finding, the inner light, to quote one of the Beatles' more wayward songs. But this isn't, is it? When
No,
Scott 4 is difficult, and there are moments where you can listen to it and think, yeah, I kind of see why people were scared off by this. But when it's difficult, it's because it's confronting something that is cold and horrible, and it's easy to see why that was less of a grabby, sellable thing than, hey man, just drop out, just let your mind wander where it will. And here comes Scott Engel singing about the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in the middle of all of that.
it's rather telling that of the time the Beatles were like, haha, oh, mean Mr. Mustard, and Scott Walker's going, my God, there are war crimes in Eastern Europe. We must do something about this. And it it is one of those things, sadly, where it is the right place, wrong time in the
Mm,
sense of success. Because, I mean, regardless of success, thankfully, Scott Walker's Scott 4 has lasted on.
yeah,
It's got a real legacy there that can't be extracted from it. It's always going to have that, and I think it's this is particularly an album for me that my memories associated with it a lot of the time are, it's one of the first great examples that I've had of a real perfect album doing nothing commercially, and
yeah.
it's not to say that I started delving deeper into discographies because of it, but it's certainly one of those where it's, oh well, if this didn't chart and this didn't do well, what else is out there beyond the top 40? And it's
Yeah.
why I've got a real disdain for the top 40 now, because
Mm.
a lot of people listen to that, and rightly so, because there is stuff that is good in the top 40. Cliff Richard's new Christmas album, for instance. But again, it's like Mr. Blobby was a number one hit,
Yeah.
like the top 40 should not be an element of commercial success, should to some degree chart the success of an artist, but it shouldn't be the be all and end all, because some of the greatest artists and albums of all time have not hit the top 40.
Well,
And
it's like
it's,
you mentioned earlier, Lou Reed, and when I was growing up, it was like it was far enough after the 60s for people to be nostalgic for it and for us to be on like multiple cycles of nostalgia about the 60s, but it was also too recent for people to lie about it. So I've sort of seen the narrative on Lou Reed change, that when I was growing up, it was axiomatic that the Velvet Underground were like, they were the quintessential, very important band who didn't
yes,
sell any records. That was one of the things they were famous for. But when Lou Reed died in like 2012,
2012,
2013,
yeah, it was just after that Metallica collaboration.
what a coincidence?
Definitely not.
Definitely not. But
For legal reasons, I must say it is a coincidence. Just, just in case the estate of Lou Reed come after us. and say, we're not going to financially charge you, but we are going to make you listen to Lulu.
But after he died, I remember reading a column from Suzanne Moore where she was talking about, oh, I bought White Light, White Heat when it came out, and I took it on the school bus, and all my friends were really excited. I thought, no, you fucking didn't. There weren't any school kids in 1968 listening to White Light, White Heat.
It's it's rather telling that some people kind of have that abridged look at history. I can't wait in 20 years' time when people say, I remember when I bought Scott 4 on record, everybody was so excited. I got the last copy in the shop. And it's, well, you probably did because they sold about 20. It's the abridged delicacies of history, isn't it? It's the kind of, oh, I was there for that period of history. It's like, okay, well, you were probably there for other periods of history. It's like the amount of screeners and stuff that we are sent daily and every day by musicians. There's lightning in a bottle chance that they'll actually make it big, and those that do, it's like, oh, I was there for that. I was there for that resurgence. You don't have to pretend you were there for Lou Reed's great renewal, but people do because it's now relevant and it's pop culture.
I mean, I was there when Lulu was released. I was definitely there for that.
I mean, I love the Lulu stuff where it's Lou Reed came out and said this is an album for people that read, which if you're working with Metallica, not good. But no, success should not merit the integrity of an album, which I think is such a bizarre statement to say because it's obvious, but it's not at the same time. You look at the charts, and if Ed Sheeran's not at the top, then something's gone horribly wrong. And I couldn't hand on heart say, well, this is better than Scott Walker because it's in the chart. I think there's a lot of credence to the fact that the charts are just what's popular, and what is popular is not inherently what's best. Unfortunately, that sort of blend has happened. Fortunately, Scott 4 has been remembered. It's taken its rightful place as one of sort of, I'd say, the best albums of the 1960s. It's stunning.
I think it is the one, maybe the only album where I have unironically used the sort of the cliche that forms the name of this book that we're going through. I have said to someone that Scott 4 is an album that everyone has to hear, and I meant that. And it's very hard for me to mean something like that because I'm chronically ambiguous. I'm like fatally addicted to being able to see too many sides of the argument. It's only through some miracle that I'm not a liberal Democrat.
You can only fence it for so long
until
splinters begin to form. I think Scott 4 is genuinely just not even from like the legacy of it and the people it's influenced and how much it's done. Just purely from a musical sense, it is an essential album. It is incredible.
Yeah, all this would be worthless if the songs don't stand up. And the songs are just like a non-stop chain of absolutely fabulously written, fabulously sung. Even when the darkness comes into it, it's darkness in a way that's kind of punchy and purposeful. Like Hero of the War is the most obvious example.
Hero of the War is stunning.
And it's a deceptively nice sounding song that has some very, very, very dark lyrics.
Yes. And it was I think was it BBC Proms? Richard Hawley did a cover of that. And
really?
It's haunting. Really good. And it's that lyrical integrity that lends itself to covers, and it lends itself to Scott Walker's sort of lyrical style, is that these are very, what's the word? Very, what the fuck is what's the word? The word for approachable. They're very approachable songs.
Yes, yeah.
Very approachable, but then at the same time are very delicate, very dark, and quite sinister. There is a real soundscape here that very much identifies with what Scott Walker did for the rest of his career. This is sort of the populist sort of, this is meant to be the popular one that gets people interested, and then as he drifts in, he goes to stuff like Tilt, like The Drift, like Bish Bosh. And he did that anyway, regardless of the commercial success of Scott 4, which is great, but it's interesting to see what would have happened if this had been a success like it rightfully should have been. This is far better than a lot of the stuff that was popular at the time, and it's in the same genre of it, You think of baroque
It's
pop and how
yeah,
broad it is, especially then. I mean, even if you
mm,
go take it a step back, it's like if you just look at the albums that were out at the time, it's there are certain albums that just shouldn't be up there. I
yeah.
mean, yeah, but that's that you can say that about any year, you know.
Completely. Yeah, I think it's always a great service when the BBC does some of their archive music things, whether it's repeating old Top of the Pops, whether it's doing Pick of the Pops. It's always salutary to just listen to a single week's chart and think, oh yeah, there's some right shit in here. Like even if it's from a canonically great year, there
Yeah,
will be some terrible music in that chart.
yeah. For every amazing hit single, there's always like a Robson and Jerome novelty pop
Yes.
song at the top, and it's again, it's a shame that sort of. I mean, I think at the time as well, if you look at Scott Four as sort of a what it is fundamentally, it's a lot of acoustic ballads,
Mm,
and then you look at what was releasing around it, and it's stuff like Court of the Crimson King, Abbey Road, kind of
yeah.
Blue would released as well. So it's very much the after effects of the psychedelia period are draining out all these artists. They're essentially wringing them out, hanging them out to dry, and you're seeing a real cultural shift to the darker stuff that Scott Walker was singing about. He was just a bit too early, which is a real
Yeah,
tragedy.
maybe. Yeah, I think one of the things with the other examples you cited there that maybe makes this album's commercial failure a bit more understandable is that in the late 60s and early 70s, there's this urge to get more complex. The nation's music teachers have listened to Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and they're all saying that, Lennon and McCartney are the Mozart of our times. So there's this push for credibility, and credibility is seen as being synonymous with excess. If we can make a song that's longer and more complex and has a bigger orchestra and more difficult time signatures than anything else, that's going to show we're serious musicians. Whereas when you compare this to Scott Walker's previous solo albums and even the Walker Brothers stuff, it shows an urge to strip back, to get simpler. Rhymes of Goodbye is the sort of ballad that anyone else around that time would absolutely drown in strings and timpani, but he just plays it on his acoustic guitar, and it's made more poignant by the fact that you can hear the humanity, you can hear the people in the room playing.
Absolutely, and it's quite telling that in the latter stages of his career, he kind of switched that. He went away from
Mm,
that humanity and instead showed a depravity, but with the same structure, with the same sort of reservation and the same ability to not overload a track. It's
yeah,
very easy. I mean, it's the wall of sound effect, isn't it? That lingering commodity of, oh, if you make it sound louder and bigger, it sounds better. But
yes,
there is something to be said for, I mean, stuff on the tilt where it's just his voice and that's it, and it just lingers. And then
yeah,
a string section will come in, and it's not layering, it's just one after the other, gentle and quite vicious as well at the same time. The flip side of that is the same fundamentals of Tilt on Scott 4, but with a
mm,
warmer feeling to it, a more kind of the it's that crossover. It's like you mentioned with the Walker Brothers stuff. It's moving from that pop enjoyment, happy, fun, lovely sounding stuff towards a darker effect, but while maintaining that sort of niceness to it. There is a warmth to the lyrics of the Seventh Seal that
yeah,
it doesn't quite capture the horrifying depravity of Bergman's movie, but it does give an accurate retelling of it. And that Morricone beginning, it's quite warm. To start your album with that and just drop it, oh, trumpet's lovely, oh, acoustic
mm,
guitar. It's kind of like a mariachi type flamenco feel to it. It's very fun, it's very upbeat. And again, it's more of a testament to the lyrics, the sudden stops, the real strong wordplay that comes in the B side, that a lot of it comes together as that transitional period for a solo artist. Very few that pull it off, but
yeah.
the few that do reap the rewards tenfold, and rightly so. And it's
I
it's
think
just wonderful.
if you could sort of stick Scott 3 and Scott 4 together, if you could take them as if they were a single record, you can absolutely hear his late period sound in that. Scott 3 is the one that goes most in with the kind of haunting, atonal, almost dark ambient kind of arrangements that you get on an album like Tilt or Bish Bosh. Whereas Scott 4 is the one I think that most breaks with the kind of balladier tradition in its lyrics.
Yes.
Scott 4 is the one that's the most thematically ambitious. You listen to a song like The Old Man's Back Again, and you are not at all surprised when you hear this man did a 13-minute music concrete suite about the death of Mussolini. You think, yeah, of course he did. Yeah.
It is amazing that Scott Walker managed throughout his career to just sort of make those wild card songs very placid and very sort of accepted. It's like, oh, Scott Walker's done a 30-minute track of Mussolini. Yeah, it sounds about right for Scott. Yeah, yeah. It's they walk into the studio. What are you doing today, Scott? I'm doing a 22-minute somber acoustic horror show track. It's like, very good. Crack on. We'll release that when it's finished.
Well,
It's
on the later records, it's worth pointing out he was on 4AD, which has this image as being like the artiest of art rock labels. You know, it's the record label that brought you the Cocteau Twins and His Name Is Alive, and you know, really quite austere things. And it's quite stunning to think about Scott Walker's peers, of the people in his age group who started out when he started out, and thinking, how many of them would get on 4AD?
that's the thing. It's like I think that eventually, I think the warm sort of end for Scott Walker's career is that he did achieve what he'd set out to do in the late '60s. He
Yes.
managed to stay true to his sound, despite a pretty rough period in the '70s and '80s. We Had It All is a release that is credited to his discography, and there's nothing better than outlaw country rock. But he stayed true to the sort of Scott 3 to Scott 4 period,
Yeah.
and if anything, doubled down on it, like in
Yeah.
'95 and onwards. And to see him actually finally hit that success, I do think part of that later success helps people look back on Scott 4 with a bit of intrigue and a bit of, oh, well, what's he sound like in the early days? Very different. But it does lend itself to giving people that push to go and listen to his earlier works, which is fantastic. But it's a shame that the earliest work that didn't get any credit for how good it was is his best work.
Yeah, but there's a it's nice to know that he was, you know, most people who release albums that are this good and this underheard do not live to get to see them reclaimed. Nick Drake never lived to see people, you
Yeah.
know, treat his solo albums as the touchstones for a genre that they are. Delia Derbyshire was in her very late years before she heard that there were bands like, you know, Portishead or Ad N2X who absolutely venerated her radiophonic workshop soundtracks. So it's nice to know that Scott Walker was able not just to see people rediscover it, but to profit off it, to
Yes.
realize that people are connecting with this music I'm making. I might be able to make something new. I might be able to make Climate of Hunter now. I might be able to make The Drift. You know, that's nothing but a victory. The fact that he
Yeah.
had to eat shit for like the best part of the 1970s is unfortunate, but he
It
did
is.
win in the end.
Well, that's the thing. It's shocking that so few artists have actually seen that success be paid.
Yeah,
I always think Johnny Cash is a great example of that because he spent that long
yeah,
in the wilderness, and Rick Rubin essentially salvaged it for him. He pulled him out of the depths, and it was through
mm,
no fault of his own. He wasn't in the depths because he'd done anything wrong. He was in the depths because the period had moved on, but he knew that music could still be successful.
yeah,
And for Scott Walker to actually reap the benefits of that, like Johnny Cash did with the American series, is really
yeah,
warming. It's very
yeah.
it's warm for the heart, which is weird because Scott Walker spent the better half of 20 years trying to make us all cold and ruinous and ravaged.
Yes.
Which is brilliant though, and it does bring us to the inevitable question of what the best track is on Scott 4, which is a tougher question than I thought it'd be, and I don't think my answer will surprise you.
Okay, okay. I see. I can't really predict what you're going to say. I think there is a part of me that feels uneasy about saying the old man's back again because it is
Mm.
such an anomaly in his work. It is. I feel like I should probably choose something a bit more Scott Walkery. In which case, I don't know. It could be. it could still be On Your Own Again. I think On Your Own Again still sounds as good as it does when I heard it on that Radiohead documentary. It's a wonderful song.
Yeah, well, that's a good choice. It's not none of those were my choice. That might fundamentally through. Oh, I listened to this that much through a period of about 3 months. It's got to be
Right.
the Seventh Seal. I go for some reason I would play it whenever I could for about 3 months.
Yeah.
I could be like out on a walk, and the first song I put is like Scott Walker, and then I'd shuffle it and be like straight in LCD sound system or something. It's like, no, lovely, get a bit of Scott Walker on. No, I think I listened to it that much over 2021 that I think it was one of my most played songs in like the Spotify roundup, which is
Wow.
mad because
Yeah.
I only listened to it from May until about July, and I was like, all right, on to the next thing. But no, that song is wonderful. I think it's the Morricone touch for me, and then sort of the links it had to film at the time when I was still trying to be like, oh, I'm a film journalist. Was like, nah, bollocks, so that's boring. But it caught me at a very transitional period in where I was, and I think for that reason alone, more for its importance to me than anything else, it has to be kind of my pick for this. And it also helps that it's the first song on the album, so that's my actual defense. It's the first song on the album. It's the first thing you'll hear. So
There's an art to a really great first track, I think.
there is, and there's very few that get it right because I mean I think the most fundamental part of any album is its set list and how it's organized.
Mm.
It's you can't just splatter them all over the place and go there you go, shuffle it, why not? um Scott Four's got a very intrinsic pacing to it. It's very
Mm.
formatted. It's very I put this on this morning. I didn't realize some of the songs had switched to the next one. It's just a very natural progression.
I
um
think it has a very interesting ending too, I think, where you've got that 3-song passage of Duchess, Get Behind Me, and Rhymes of Goodbye, and it does feel like the windows are coming open a bit, and you've got through all this very dark stuff about disabled war veterans and
yeah,
Soviet politics, and now, we're coming back round to love. There's something like warm in this album at last.
it is that warmth, and it's kind of because obviously the Beatles did back in the USSR, which I
Mm.
suppose is a bit lighter than Ye Gods, Czechoslovakia has fallen, but it's still on the nose of
Yes,
communism in Eastern Europe, which is it,
it's
it,
still a
it
Cold War song. Yeah.
it's a Cold War song, but I think it says a lot about the fundamentals of how they are presented. If
Mm.
it's a light and poppy album from the people that did Revolver, it may do better than Scott Walker, which is a shame, but reality bites.
My one criticism I would have of this album, and it's
Mm.
not so much a flaw with the album as an entreaty to explore, an entreaty for listeners to explore the rest of Scott Walker's work, is that the arrangements, while very good, are not done by Angela Morley, who did his earlier solo
Uh,
records and was a great interpreter of Scott's sound. Like I say, when you listen to Scott 3, you can
yeah,
hear in 1968 that kind of skin prickling atonal horror sound starting to creep in, and it's remarkably ahead of its time for a
yeah.
pop album of the late 60s. But this has a lot of arrangers, and the best of them I would say is Wally Knight, who does On Your Own Again and Boy Child, the latter of which does get towards that kind of sound landscape that he would use later on.
No, I agree. It's 30th Century Man will always just take it out of me.
It's
Incredible.
great, yeah.
Unbelievable. I think this is the one artist I can think of where everybody says, "Oh, he was ahead of his time." That is actually a negative for Scott Four. He was ahead of his time, yes, and that time was just so far removed from what he'd accomplished that everybody rejected it. Um,
Yes.
which is a shame, but at least it's on the list. I imagine there'll be no replacement album because that was this kind of the wrap up question. Do we replace Scott Four with anything else? I think it would be
No, you
mad.
can't do. There's nothing else like Scott
No.
Ford, and I think even if you picked out a Nick Cave album or something else that was like clearly influenced by it, you're still dealing with something different. I think the only thing I would rather listen to is an album from a parallel universe where this was a hit and they allowed him to just do his own thing with Till the Band Comes In rather than force him to record covers for the second side.
What type of choice is that? That's I mean, funny in a way.
It's
You know,
one of those things where that was my first quibble with the excerpt from the book that you read
yeah.
out at the start. That said, "Oh, for the rest of the 70s, he was a recluse," and it's like, I'm sure he'd have preferred that, but the truth is,
Yeah, the
for
truth
the
is,
rest of the 70s, he produced terrible, commercially mandated covers albums before reforming the Walker Brothers to make an album that is like half solid, decent pop stuff and half avant-garde terror tunes about Pinochet's Chile, which is, again, a kind of victory, I think.
it's the little things, you know. Five commercial albums for the trade-off of reuniting the Walker Brothers to make avant-garde pop. It's yeah. There's a lot of quibbles to have with that entry, but I think the main one is the fact that in actual essence, the most productive part of Scott Walker's career is the shy recluse period.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, I mean, till the band comes in from We Had It All was a very rough spot.
He
But
still refuses to allow a lot of those albums to be reissued famously. And I
yeah,
remember during one of his very rare interviews, I remember a Guardian journalist saying, there are some people who've heard bootlegs of those and they say they're not so bad. You can hear hints of the darkness in them.
yeah.
And Walker just burst out laughing and said, "You probably hear hints of the darkness because I was miserable making them."
It was not refined darkness; it was actual darkness, which is a worrying place for any artist. And
Yes,
I mean, that's speaking of worrying. That's the end. That's it. That's the end. Not of Scott
that's
Walker
it.
because that he's got more albums, but it's the end for this podcast. We're at the point
Indeed.
where we plug the socials. We do our bit to raise our awareness on social media, which I'm furious about because my account's no longer relevant in government or journalism. It's now just a legacy account, which is fancy way of saying I
Oh,
was verified before Twitter Blue became a thing.
it's a legacy account by which
Legacy.
it means, yeah, that's a badge of honor, isn't it? It means that you don't make a charitable donation to a billionaire for a service that is functionally no different to the one you've already got.
It's the big thing for me was like, oh, everybody was going on about 50% off, and it's like 50% less ads. It's like I've got an ad blocker and I've got no ads.
Yes.
0% of half of 0% is still 0%. Like there's no fundamental benefit to getting Twitter Blue. But I've
No.
ended every other podcast episode slating Twitter Blue for taking away my higher powers of being verified before it was cool, or rather after it was cool and before Musk made it shit.
Well, I think as this episode has proven, being into something before it was cool is the sort of achievement that never. Your blue tick is the Scott 4 of blue ticks, whereas everyone paying $8 a month is just getting the movie goer or something.
So it says my account may or may not be relevant, but it also says that about England international footballers. So me and like Jack Grealish are on the same level. Now I don't know. I mean, I've won the same amount of World Cups as that man, so I assume we're on the same page. But I don't know what he thinks of Scott Walker. So
Yes,
who knows? But if you really want to, you can follow my verified before it was cool account. I don't pay for that shite. Twitter or at Ewan Gleadow, EWANGLEADOW. You can follow Don't Listen to This Pod on Twitter as well, DLTT Pod. Graham, where can people find you these days?
well, I'm on a Twitter with no blue tick at all, which
Oh,
increasingly looks like the sound
does
investment.
actually, if I could get rid of mine, I would.
But you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Graham W Film. I host the Geek Show's Pop Screen podcast, which you can find at anchor.fm/popscreen, where every week we review, well, every fortnight it is now, we review a different film, either starring or about a pop star. Ewan, of course, has been on many an episode. And if you enjoy that, we've also got Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Geek Show. And I'm also on Letterboxd, which is, again, increasingly, obviously, the Geiger Chad of social networks, isn't it? It's the one that counts,
It is. It is.
the one that hasn't shut the bed yet.
I remember people got what was it, Mastodon?
Oh, yeah.
I looked into it, by which I mean I opened it in a new tab accidentally, and I thought it's not for me. That I closed it.
Well, half of these things, like I'm seeing some of my friends say, I went on Hive and it's just crashing all the time. And it's like, yeah, because these things are designed to have about 20 people using them at the same time. They just got bored. They thought we could update the script, but it's not as if anyone is actually on these sites. What about Google Plus? Has Google Plus had a comeback yet? That's what I want to know.
It needs one. I don't think people realise that when you see a 570 increase percent in your user base, the one server you host in Bulgaria is going to crash. It's like Letterboxd all over again. It's like, oh my, more than 100 people on our website, and then it blows up every day.
Letterboxd was wise to set itself up in what I predict, if you're listening to this show in like 10 years' time, will be the only functioning democracy in the world.
Yeah, yeah, it will be. There's not even any funny retort to that. That will be the
No,
last democracy.
they've even got the best version of Taskmaster now. It's all over.
That's it. They've taken from us what we once held, just like they took Scott Walker's studio work from us, making him dish out contemporary releases of cover pop songs. What a turgid way to end a podcast.
Yeah, well, it's appropriate that our Scott Walker episode ends in the most depressing fashion possible, I suppose.
It is. I mean, it's what he would have wanted, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, but
Just
that's it.
put like an atonal string bed under this, and you're sorted. It's a new Scott Walker album.
Just the synths of Twin Peaks just underscoring it all. Wonderful. But no, thank you very much for hopping on to do another episode of this madhouse thing.
It's a pleasure.
More than 1,000 to go still. See you next time.